Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another video. So I've had the Asus ROG Strix 3080 for about 2 months now, and I wanted to share some different settings I've been using and what the performance is like with this thing. I'm going to focus mainly on overclocking rather than thermals and acoustics, since it's sort of an odd scenario in my mini ITX case where I kind of just squeezed everything together and hope for the best. I tested out 9 games total on stock and on various overclock settings, so let's check it out. Starting off, I use Shadow of the Tomb Raider's benchmark because of its consistency. That way it allows me to capture what kind of difference changing these settings make. It really shows how well it scales across the board. Everything was set to Ultra as well as RTX to the highest setting and HDR enabled, although I don't think HDR has much of an impact. So stock we got 58.5 frames per second average and 29.81% lows. Bumping up the core to plus 70 and the memory to plus 300, we see a 1.7% jump to 59.5 frames per second. I left the power limit on default since I wanted to see how much of a difference it would make versus having it enabled. As you can see, cranking it to the max, which is 121, we squeeze an extra 1 frame per second. However, it did come at the cost of extra power usage, as I'll show you very shortly, so not sure if it's worth it in this particular scenario. 150 on the core and 600 on the memory was the max I was okay with pushing the card to. As you can see, we got 61.3 frames per second, and then bumping the power limit on that brought it to 62.3 frames per second, which is the best result I got on this test. With that overclock, the card was running stable at around 2055 MHz, which is pretty impressive. With the power limit set to default and the same settings otherwise, it was running at around 1965 MHz, obviously being limited by the power in this case. In the past, I noticed whenever I increased the power limit on any of my cards, there would always be an increased coil whine, so I wanted to test it out and see if you guys can notice any difference. Here are the temperatures from that test. I kept everything at 100% fan speed. As I mentioned, I can almost guarantee that you will get better temps with this card, but I just wanted to focus more so on the ranges than the actual temperature. Increasing the power limit no doubt has an impact on the temps. Even with a 90% power limit, we shaved about 6 degrees during this test. Taking a look at the power usage, these are the peaks I recorded during this test. So basically these are the highest measured power usage points, but the average was around 4 to 8% lower than what you see here. Increasing the power limit does require some extra power with the highest overclock setting almost touching 600 watts. Stock, the power usage peaked at around 490 watts, with the 90% power limit surprisingly only a little lower at 476, but keep in mind the fans were running at 100% this whole time, so that might increase the power usage as well. Alright, so moving on to the other games. First up is Doom Eternal, which is my game of the year, and this game definitely benefits from a higher frame rate being such a fast-paced shooter. Luckily, this game is so well optimized that it can hit high frame rates while still being a gorgeous looking game. So stock, we got 144 frames per second average. Bumping up, we got 147.9 on the next setting, 149.9 with 150 on the core and 600 on the memory, and 156.5 frames per second when increasing the power limit, which is quite insane. Keep in mind, this is completely maxed out at 4K. The game does dip sometimes, as you can see from the 1% lows. I noticed that happening when throwing an ice bomb. I imagine because there's a lot going on, so that does lower the minimum frames a bit, but overall extremely smooth, and overclocking did improve the experience. Next up, Resident Evil 3 on max settings. Another great looking, well optimized game. This one using Capcom's in-house RE engine. Stock, we got 101.9 frames per second. Moving up 105.5 with an overclock applied. The next setting made no difference in this test at 106 frames per second average, and then adding the power limit boosted it to 110.5, about a 4.2% increase, so not too bad. Battlefield 5 set to Ultra with HDR enabled and RTX on max setting, provided 62.6 frames per second on stock, 64.9 with the overclock added, 66.4 boosting to 150 core and 600 on the memory, and 68.1 with the power limit enabled. This game scaled pretty well with the overclock, but I can see multiplayer frames being lower than single player, so I'd probably recommend running this game with RTX on low or disabled for a smoother experience. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the next game I tested. I cranked the settings to the max but with no MSAA. As you know, this game looks stunning, although it did take me a while to get everything set up, and there only seemed to be a minor difference when overclocking. 53.3 frames per second on stock, 53.9 with the overclock, 53.7 on the next setting, so basically the same within the margin of error, and 55.3 when increasing the power limit. I wanted to test out a racing game, so I tried out Need for Speed 2016, and the reason being is because I still think this is one of the best looking racing games out currently. Also, it does have an unlocked frame rate, and is pretty well optimized. The only thing missing would be HDR and an old school Need for Speed soundtrack. So frame rate wise, we got 127 stock, 130.1 with the overclock, and a decent jump when moving to 150 on the core and 600 on the memory, to about 136.3 frames per second. Increasing the power limit slider did nothing in this case. Devil May Cry 5. I don't see this game tested often, and I honestly just wanted an excuse to play it, but this game is very well optimized and scaled beautifully across the overclocks, as you'll see. It also looks amazing with HDR enabled and running at a high frame rate. So stock we got 135 frames per second with the overclock 139.9, 143.6 with the extra core and memory speed, and 148.3 with the power limit cranked. Almost a 10% increase from stock, so really good stuff. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is the only game that crashed for me, which ruined my smooth streak. So that was kind of disappointing, but I did want to try a Ubisoft game to see how it runs. This one had okay results from overclocking. We got 60.2 stock, 61.9 with the overclock, 65 bumping the speed up to 150 on the core and 600 on the memory, and increasing the power limit did nothing in this case. Last but not least, Cyberpunk 2077. I haven't played too much of the game yet, but it's apparent it's definitely more on the demanding side, especially when going to the higher settings. I'm going to show 3 different configurations that I tried out. First, I set it to the in-game Ultra preset, and these are the results I got. 41.2 frames per second stock, 41.6 with 70 on the core and 300 on the memory, 42.3 with 150 on the core and 600 on the memory, 43.5 with the power limit maxed out, so about a 5% difference in frame rate from stock. It wasn't too noticeable in this case, but perhaps once they optimize the game further, it will improve the results. Next, I used these custom settings with base level ray tracing enabled, and this is what I ran the game on for the most part. I put the preset to high, disabled motion blur, increased antistrophic aliasing to 16 since there's not much of a performance hit, and also enabled the contact shadows since that does improve the looks of the faces in game. On these settings we got 46.7 stock, 49.3 with the overclock, 48.8 with the extra core and memory speed, so basically no difference between these two again, and 50.9 with the power limit. Now keeping the exact same settings but with DLSS enabled on the quality setting, we got 71.6 frames per second stock, 73.3 with the overclock, 73.7 with 150 on the core and 600 on the memory, and 78.8 with the power limit cranked. Honestly, this is the most enjoyable way to play it. I normally don't bother with DLSS, but there wasn't too much of a visual hit and the increased frame rate was definitely worth it. So there it is, the RTX 3080 Strix OC, definitely a great card. I hope you guys found the benchmarks helpful. Let me know what kind of results you guys got, I'd be curious to see. But thank you so much for watching, I'll see you guys on the next one.